Welcome to another exciting DBQ adventure. I'm your host, Mr. Vincent. For this episode, we're going to look at the Aztecs.
The Aztecs!
More specifically, in agriculture and their use of human sacrifices to keep the sun god happy. So get your packets out, your pencil sharpened, and let's get learning. Before we get started with the background information here, we need to make sure that you're familiar with some of the key terms that are important for this DBQ. You'll find these terms on page 343 of your packet, and you can use those descriptions on that page to help you answer some of the questions on page 345 to fill out your background essay questions. So I'm going to give you a little bit of some hints here as to what those terms are, but feel free to look at the background essay as well. So the first term we have is
Conquistadors.
That is where the Spanish and the Portuguese, what their soldiers were called during the time period known as the Age of Exploration. For this exercise, or for this DBQ, we're going to talk about the Spanish, and they're under the direction of Cortez in the year 1519. So we're going to talk about his conquistadors just briefly. It was those conquistadors, or professional soldiers, that took whatever they wanted, whomever they wanted, for the purpose of whatever they needed in order to conquer or take over the territory that they wanted. You'll notice that conquistadors, the term itself, looks kind of like the word conquer. That is not a coincidence. Our next term is
Pre-conquest.
Simply put, it's the time before Cortez got there, the pre-conquering time period. Our next term,
Tribute.
no, that's not the kind of tribute we're talking about. The kind of tribute we're talking about are the Aztecs, who used the tributes from the tribes that they conquered in order to tax them. So they would tax these other tribes in the form of military support or agricultural things like food and other types of things that they might produce in order to pay their tax and keep them at peace with the ruling Aztec tribe. Our next term,
Chinampas.
you're going to become more familiar with this term as we go forth because it is kind of part of what this DBQ is about. So stay tuned for more details on this particular term.
Deities.
Is a word that we have used before in some of our other discussions. It's just a word that we use to talk about any culture that has multiple gods. And instead of having to talk about all these different gods by name, we just use the word deities. Since the Aztecs have about 128 major deities, that's just how we're going to refer them to, as deities or gods. They're all different gods for different kinds of purposes. So that's deities. Our last term that we're going to talk about is
Huitzilopochtli.
and that's the name of the Aztecs' most highest god, their sun god. So we'll come back to him in a little bit. In 1519, Hernando Cortez and about 500 conquistadors entered the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, which was around present-day Mexico City. Much of what we have in direct information about the Aztecs comes from documents of soldiers and missionaries who visited the area after Cortez had already been there and conquered it. What we're interested in, though, is the time before Cortez, the pre-conquest time period. What we do know about this particular area of Tenochtitlan is that it consisted or was inside of a large basin. If you think of a basin, it's kind of like a bowl, but this is a huge bowl, okay? Roughly the size of Rhode Island. Well, when it rains, and rains a lot, it does what a lot of basins do. It fills up with water. And when it filled up with water, it actually created 5 large islands. These islands were interconnecting, so they had a little passageways between them. But these islands were very important for their civilization because it created their capital city in the center. It also created a way for them to use their agriculture, which we'll talk about later on. As I mentioned a second ago, their large center island of Tenochtitlan consisted of about 300,000 inhabitants. That's about half the size of the city of Milwaukee. So if you keep in mind, this happened back in the early 1500s, and this major city was huge, probably a little bit bigger than the size of Madison. So the fact that this civilization was that old, that's early on in its civilization, but was able to control that many people, that's pretty impressive. After the defeat of some of the tribes, what would happen is, early on, before the Aztecs became the huge empire that they were, they had all these smaller tribes. And the Aztecs was one of these smaller groups of people. Once the Aztecs was able to successfully defeat all these other tribes, they set up this main city on that huge island. And in order to get the support they needed to survive, they had to get these tributes. Tributes isn't like what we saw earlier with the Hunger Games. It's actually kind of like a tax that these smaller communities, these smaller tribes had to pay in order to keep the peace with the ruling Aztecs. So some of these tributes typically consisted of military support, with the creation of maybe like arrows and spears and men for their military, but it would also consist of agricultural ideas or agricultural things that would produce food, or the food itself that would support the empire. It's also important to notice, or to know, that the Aztecs were very religious. Like a lot of the other cultures we've talked about, they had certain religious ceremonies and traditions that were important to them. As I mentioned earlier, they had over 128 different main deities, primary deities. But it's the sun god that is most important for our discussion and what we're going to be using with the DBQ. So what we need to do as historians is question, in this case anyway, what is more important to remember the Aztecs for? Was it their ability to use agriculture in a useful and meaningful and completely original way, or their use of human sacrificing to appease their sun god? Because their sun god was thirsty. He needed human blood, he needed human hearts. Which of those two should we spend the most time focusing on if we're historians? So, with that, we need to look at these cultures and decide which one is more important. As we go forward, we're going to answer that question with our documents, so please make sure that you are looking at our 5 DBQ documents that relate to this particular activity. You will get some more information on the next DBQ video if you choose to watch it. I would encourage you to do that if you need some assistance. So with that, feel free to take a look at the video. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you later.